Hi, everyone. Before we start the podcast, we wanted to mention that if it seems like there's a lack of conversation around the current Black Lives Matter demonstrations and protests around the country, it is because we recorded this podcast shortly after the protests began in Minneapolis, as we will mention. The Black community has experienced incomprehensible pain and loss, and we recognize that to achieve our mission of ending violence, we must work to dismantle racism, along with all other forms of oppression. As we mark the start of Pride Month with this podcast, we recognize that the queer community could not advance were it not for Black and people of color activists and allies pushing the movement forward for the betterment of all LGBTQ plus people, and this podcast is not intended to take away from the current conversations around justice and protests. We hope that you are taking care of your needs and staying safe. We will also be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about Pride Month. My name is Emilie Mitchell. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center. With me today, I have Kevin Fox. Kevin uses he, him pronouns. He is a registered mental health counselor intern with the state of Florida. Kevin worked as a high school teacher while receiving his Master's of Arts in Clinical Mental Health Counseling from Rollins. He worked with adolescents with substance use issues, Equality Florida for LGBTQ plus rights, and worked in the UF Health Cancer Center at Orlando Health, counseling and performing therapy with cancer patients and their families. His passion when working with clients is to help them increase their resilience and satisfaction with their everyday lives. He seeks to help clients increase their meaning from life and live more authentically and honestly. Thank you so much for being here today, Kevin.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about Pride and Lady Gaga's newest album release.
I love it. I also have returning Emilie Collins. Emilie uses she, her pronouns. Emilie is an LGBTQ plus victim advocate and crisis counselor in an adjunct position between two agencies here in Central Florida, the Victim Service Center and Zebra Coalition. Emilie has her master's in clinical social work from Florida State University. She has experience working with trauma in various settings and currently specializes in working with the LGBTQ plus community after they experience sexual assault. Emilie is also passionate about raising awareness on various social issues through training and outreach. Emilie, thank you for being here and returning with us as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be back.
Absolutely. So June is Pride Month, and we are kicking it off this year by having this episode explore what the history of Pride is, what Pride Month is like in Orlando, and how it will look this year. So with that in mind, I just wanted to throw the question out there for whoever wants to start off. What does Pride Month mean to both of you?
All right, I'll go first. So this is really a loaded question for me because Pride has so much meaning for me. So I was raised in a very small town, and I was raised by a family of activists. So my grandparents marched with Martin Luther King, and I grew up hearing all of their stories. And so to me, like, while I have my own personal connections to Pride, being a lesbian myself, I think so much about like the activism that led towards establishing Pride, how it started and what it is today, and the importance of that in really just raising awareness and visibility. And then, of course, my own personal connections. Like, just Pride is just a space where we can go and be ourselves and be comfortable no matter who we are and not be judged. And it's always just so important to have that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Kevin, what does Pride mean to you?
For me, so the day of Pride, like the day of the actual parades and the festivals, that's always about like having fun, like doing good work, especially being here at VSC and attending Prides, working. But at the core, that day of Pride, I think, is to have fun and be ourselves as a community in a safe space without fear of judgment. But yeah, I think Pride in general is about visibility and reminding people that we've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go as far as gay and trans rights are concerned. And so and really that's year round, like, Pride is a month, but it's also like how to feel about yourself every day of the year. And I think Pride just jumpstarts that for us every year.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So speaking of, Pride Month in general, what exactly is the national history of Pride?
So, yeah, Pride, we just celebrated 50 years of Pride last year. So Pride itself, the moment that kind of started this idea of Pride was the Stonewall riots in 1969 in June.
June 28th. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Which was when police raids and brutality got so bad in different gay bars, and the harassment was just to a peak that the patrons at the Stonewall Inn were sick of it, and an activist by the name of Marsha P. Johnson finally had enough and threw, quote unquote, the first brick, where they were finally saying enough is enough and we're going to fight for our rights and we're not going to put up with this harassment anymore. One fun fact is that came 24 hours after Judy Garland's death, so people are like linking it because she was a big queer icon, still is. And so that was the same week of her passing. So some say that the grief from that escalated to cause that. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what they were all thinking.
Right.
But, interesting chain of events for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I spent my day yesterday watching different documentaries about Marsha P. Johnson and Harvey Milk just to learn a little bit more about the history of Pride. And it just seems like it started because these people who experienced this oppression over and over time, they just finally on June 28th, those early mornings, the police came to raid Stonewall Inn, as I'm sure they did all the time, and they just had enough, and they were like, we're not going to sit back and take it anymore, and we're going to fight back. And so that's how you hear about people like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who were actually drag queens of color. They identified as drag queens. It's also interesting to see how different, because back in the 60s and 70s the language was a lot different than how it is now.
Right.
So you can't really talk about Pride without talking about those people and about those people of color who really started the movement. And then fast forward to the 70s and you've got Harvey Milk in San Francisco, who was one of the first openly gay politicians, who actually only served for 11 months on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors before he was assassinated. And it's just, you can't talk about our history without acknowledging these people. We also have another one of our trailblazers who have made a lot, you might have seen in the news just this past week, Larry Kramer, who was a big HIV and AIDS activist. Also have to acknowledge the AIDS movement, the AIDS crisis, especially right now during this COVID-19 crisis that we're all living through. Larry Kramer was one of the first people to acknowledge that he was really the whistleblower for the AIDS crisis, and he passed away this past week. Yeah,
and that kind of, I guess, if jumping decade from decade, that really defined the 80s, and the gay rights movement was the AIDS crisis, and how that was such a scare that in many ways it pushed the gay rights movement back, because now there's this fear of we can't let gay people get too close because they're gonna spread the AIDS.
Wow.
The original name of AIDS was, I think it was GRIT. It was gay-related something. But
Really?
the first two words were gay-related, like immuno. I don't know. Grid. I think it was gay-related immuno disease.
Immune disease, maybe?
Yeah, something like that.
Wow, I
And
had no idea.
yeah, because they assumed, well, this is only in gay people, so it's a gay-related only disorder. And that
Wow.
was like super early when they thought just coughing could pass it, and just a handshake could give someone AIDS. And that really defined the 80s, I think, for the gay rights movement, was the AIDS crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting too because, we hear a lot now, we talk all the time about how trans folks and people of color are often forgotten in our movement. And in some of the documentaries that I was watching, there's like this weird shift from, this movement was started by trans people and people of color, and then somehow through like the 70s and 80s, like if you think about Pride now, I think a lot of people automatically assume like white cisgender gay males, and like that's, our history is so much more than that. And it's just interesting to see like there seemed to be a shift in going from like, okay, it's about queer folks no matter what their background is, within the LGBTQ community, it's the LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and there's also the T for the transgender, and it's all like, gender and sexuality are very different, and it all gets lumped together as if we're just like one big community. But I think that sometimes different pieces of the community can be easily forgotten because of that. Mm-hmm. And when I was watching footage of the marches that were happening in like the 70s and the 80s and even like the 90s and even probably sometimes today, you see people, they were literally, their sign said lesbians and gays, and they had just like completely forgotten about the whole rest of the community. And it's just so interesting to see like how, like even Marsha P. Johnson, her death, she died on July 6th in 1992, and it was ruled a suicide, but the evidence from her death, like everyone that knows her says that there's no way that this was a suicide. So here we have a trans person in 1992, and who the police didn't even really try to investigate her murder. There were so many different people who could have murdered her, and they just ruled it a suicide without even thinking about it. And we still see that in the news now. We still see like there is an epidemic of trans people being murdered, trans people of color being murdered, and we see the news outlets misgendering them all the time. So it's just, we have marriage equality, we have all of these different things that we've won, but there's just so much work that still needs to be done within our community until we have like full equal rights.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm hearing that, it's important to come together as a community, but also not forgetting, that the trans people basically, mm-hmm. and other people that are marginalized even further, I think in a sense, maybe not further, but at least maybe differently a mm-hmm. little bit, and that's really important to not forget. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And we were talking about, Pride being in June, and it must be from the Stonewall riots that was why it's in June. But I'd like to talk a little bit about briefly, what is the Orlando history of Pride, and I also want to ask why Orlando Pride Month is actually in October instead of June.
Yeah, so you definitely can't talk about Pride in Orlando without acknowledging Pulse, which happened on June 12th in 2016, where we lost 49 people at the Pulse massacre. And I wasn't here after Pulse. I wasn't living in Orlando at that time. So the response that I saw was what I saw on the news. Mm-hmm. But I can say that coming to Orlando, like, you feel the love and the support from the community the second you get here. Like, Orlando's response to this tragedy was to come together and to be there for all of its members and to literally paint rainbows all over the city. Like, there's rainbow murals to honor the whole community all over the city. And it's really incredible to see that response.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, and Come Out with Pride, which is the organization that does Orlando Pride, started their first Pride with Orlando was in 2005, which, like, is weird because that's not that long ago that it took a major city. And I don't know, like, you know, obviously the history of Pride was primarily in New York, where the Stonewall riots happened, and then it spread and branched out from there into big, more gay accepting cities. But yeah, 2005 was our first one, and they actually, along with October being LGBT Education Month?
It's LGBTQ History Month.
Yeah. They try to align it to the second weekend every week so that it kind of aligns with Come Out with Pride Day. That's why it's Come Out with Pride Orlando.
Okay.
So it kind of tackles another, you know, big day, big month in the queer community.
Awesome.
Yeah. It's also not as hot in October in Florida, so I don't know if that has anything to do with it. But.
Yes. Well, and I've always wondered, and I don't know if this is official, but the Red Shirt Day, and now that has turned into Disney Gay Days, is always in June. So I don't know if also part of that's an effort to spread out the love as far as, like, these major events that Orlando houses for our community. I have to assume it does, but
it would make sense.
It's really incredible to live in Orlando because, I mean, I'll say when I moved here, I totally fought it because I grew up in Ocala. The only thing I knew about Orlando was, like, Disney World. And my fiance, then girlfriend at the time, convinced me to move here. And I would tell her all the time, I was like, I don't want to move to Disney World. And then this community is so accepting and so amazing and has such a rich history that I never want to leave, but it's really incredible.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, even having big, like, places like Disney that for a very long time that have been open to hiring and accepting members of our community into their place of employment, which is, I feel like that has to help with this part of Florida being so open, being so prideful. I always laugh when you look at, like, the election mapping and stuff. Like, Orlando's this big blue dot amidst, like, very sometimes conservative anti-LGBT mindsets in other places in Florida. So it's our own little safe haven.
Yeah. And of course you can't forget that we have the Orlando Pride.
Yes.
So we have our soccer team that I'm very much obsessed with. So
I love that. That's
great. Huge supporters.
Yeah.
Shout out. Shout out to all you soccer players listening.
Shout out Ashton Harris and Allie Krieger. We are here.
So I wanted to shift a little bit back to Paul's just real quick and just ask, what was Pride like in Orlando after Paul's?
Oh, it was... being authentically, it was both terrifying and the most exciting Pride. You know, like, I think in the back of everyone's mind was this, if it happened once, it could happen again, right? Like, and the news doesn't stop giving us coverage of horrible thing after horrible thing. Yeah. So I think there was a lot of apprehension, but I think what overcame that was the amount of pride we had in our city as a result, and just the hashtag that was going around, Keep Dancing Orlando, I think fueled that even more. But I remember, like, being there and looking up, and on top of rooftops there were snipers, there was more security than I'd ever seen, which is great, you know what I mean? We want to feel protected. We also want to feel like it's not an issue that we have to have so much protection at some point.
Right.
But I mean, it was such an invigoration, and the memorials, the tears, everything. It was really moving. It was really cool. I think moment for Come Out with Pride.
Do you remember Pride when you came here, Emily? After?
So my first Orlando Pride was when I was living here. I, again, was like, my eyes were glued to the TV all the time watching the news. And it was also unique for me because I got this job here at Victim Service Center right when I moved here. So I also work with a lot of other nonprofits. And so I was working closely, like, especially with Zebra Coalition And when all that time leading up to like Orlando United Day in June, which is the anniversary of Pulse, there are like the 49 days leading up to it, we have acts of love and kindness. And it was just like incredible. Like it was very emotional for me to see how people continue to respond and how people continue to come together. Like even this year, it's incredible to see. It's so different because, you know, usually we're getting together in person, and now of course we can't. So seeing what everyone's been doing virtually, and, you know, this crisis with COVID-19, like I hear from a lot of people who are here after Pulse, is like the communities come together the same way. Like we had One Orlando Alliance was created literally the Thursday after Pulse. Pulse happened on Saturday, and the Thursday after, they had all these different nonprofits in a room together figuring out, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to handle this? How are we going to move forward? And One Orlando Alliance now is like recognized internationally as a way to respond to a mass crisis like this because they did such a good job. So even now, like years later, it's really incredible to see how people continue to come together and support the community through acts of love and kindness, through giving back, which is how we like to handle everything in our community.
Yeah. I mean, well, still, really, the amount of, like, outpouring of love for everything that happened when Pulse occurred, like, you can still see the effects of, like, the bartenders and the entertainers that I used to see at Pulse have now been opened up and accepted at all these other bars so that they still have work, they still have their, you know, places that they can be themselves in those other safe spaces. And I think that was one thing that was cool, and just how much the community rallied. You know, straight people, like, too, allies came together, and I don't know if I don't know. I think observationally, I think that had an extra boost to the amount of support that the queer community has in Orlando. I think it, for people who maybe had biases or beliefs or judgments about gay people and queer people, I think this made a lot of people realize that it's more important to be open and accepting and loving than to waste time turning people away. You know, like, I don't know, all of a sudden businesses everywhere had rainbow flags in the corners, and donations were coming in from all over the place. So I think that was a big moment as far as how Orlando has shaped itself around the queer community afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you so much for highlighting all of that. I also wanted to ask, we were talking about the history of Pride and talking about Pride in Orlando after Pulse, but what do you think about this year's Pride? You know, what are some challenges you expect to see due to the pandemic that we're going through right now?
I don't know. It's going to be interesting. Yeah. I know that I have a friend who's on the Come Out with Pride board, and so I know there's ideas being juggled, and I don't know if I'm allowed to, like, share some of them, but I know stuff is happening, and I know it'll likely have a virtual component. You know, it's not till October, luckily, so as far as Orlando Pride, we still have some time, but I don't think with COVID, mass crowds are going to be allowed to gather for at least probably 2021. Right. So I know there's some virtual stuff and things that are being planned. I'm interested, you know.
Yeah, it'll definitely be mostly virtual this year, and I'm thankful for that because we definitely value, like, the safety and health of our community and all communities, and that's why we're doing this. So while we don't know exactly how it will change yet, like, we'll definitely also come back better than ever once we are able to gather again. So I'm not concerned about it, like, having any kind of harmful effect on our celebrations. But it definitely is, like, I always get super pumped up, like, when Pride Month is coming up, because I just, like, I sometimes forget how exciting it is, and then I start getting, like, the emails from, like, everyone's Pride lines that are coming out, and, like, all the events and stuff that are happening, and it's especially so weird right now because I think about, like, the activism that created it, and then to see all over the news right now, like, what's happening in Minneapolis, and I do think, like, you can't talk about Pride without talking about the riots that turned into Pride, and it's just such an interesting time. Like, it'll be really, really fascinating to see what unfolds over not only the rest of the year because of the COVID-19 crisis, but, like, every morning the world I wake up in, the world that I wake up in feels a little bit different than the world that I went to bed in the night before. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens during this Pride Month this year.
Yeah, very well said. So speaking of like that virtual aspect that you both highlighted, and I think we all kind of expect that as well, what are some ways in which you think people can celebrate Pride Month virtually or at home, like individually?
I don't know. I mean, there's already been a lot of creative content being pushed out there. I know Come Out with Pride has had a couple Stay In with Pride events, like virtual, where they have different members of their board talk about Pride or go through, I think they did one, or they're going to do one that goes through the history. They've had local entertainers do virtual stuff. So they've kind of done a bit of like work already in that direction, which has been fun to see. I don't know if they'll get like a parade somehow virtually created or what that will look like.
Right.
But I know that they're pushing out some content already, trying to amp people up and get people excited for whatever is coming down the road with them.
Awesome.
Yeah. Definitely all of our performers within the community, Pride is such a big time for them. Like a lot of them, I'm sure, make like the majority of the money that they make in the year. Like I'm sure they make a lot of money during that time, and that's what they survive off of. So a lot of people, if you go on like their social media, like find your favorite drag performers and go on their social media pages, and a lot of them are posting like Facebook Live stuff that you can follow. There's all kinds of like virtual dance parties that are happening.
Yeah.
If you just kind of look around for it, you should be able to find it.
Awesome. Sounds great. And also, do you think, going virtual is kind of interesting. Do you think it'll actually have a bigger reach in a sense?
I think it will, because now people all over the world can take a look, especially, not just all over Florida, but people who are just looking for something positive to watch.
Yeah.
That programming can be out there. So especially if a lot of prides are doing stuff in June and then we're further back in October, it's like it's like a bonus pride.
Right.
Right? Like it's something extra that's for us here in Orlando and for Florida, and then people all over the world, will have access to whatever fun performances or virtual content that gets created for Pride. So it keeps the Pride momentum kind of going year round.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully by October things are different, but I'm not a scientist, so I don't know.
Yeah, we don't have a crystal ball. Yeah.
I think also that this virtual world, just in general, there were a lot of people who are isolated because of disabilities or like whatever reason that they can't go out in public or can't go to like gather in a like large crowd anyways before this. They now have access to more things from like the comfort and safety of their own home. So I think that's kind of one of the silver linings that has come out of this whole thing is so many people, like we didn't have virtual services before, and now even when we open back up and do have in-person services again, we're going to continue to have those virtual services. So I think that it does have a beneficial effect because of that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And speaking of kind of like coming together virtually, but also just in general, what are some ways in which Pride Month can bring the LGBTQ plus community and beyond together during these hard times?
Well, it's tough because a lot of different places have attempted that, alone together and creating that special content that makes us feel a bit more connected. Mm-hmm. And so putting that in focus of the queer community to have a reach that's specific to us, I don't know if they'll do some more videos or programming about the history of Pride Month and making that accessible to people who are outside of our community who want to learn a bit more, or or allies who just want to take part in what we have to offer. And I hope they do something with a broad reach. I think sometimes even when things are normal, people look at Pride parades, people who maybe aren't so supportive look at Pride parades as this like flashy, gaudy, horrible showing off, and they don't understand what's behind it. So if there was some kind of content I mean, I would love to see, right, like on ABC or CBS or NBC, like something public, just like a 1 hour, the history of Pride, why we have Pride. I don't think people get it still. I think they say, like, I hear a lot now, like, well, you can get married, like, what else do you want? It's like, well, we would like not to still be harassed, and we'd like for trans people not to still be killed, and so it was never just as simple as marriage. The Civil Rights Acts passed in the 60s, and look what's still happening today. You know what I mean? Like, obviously the work doesn't just stop with one piece of legislation. So I would really love to see some kind of like content one day on primetime TV that gives people what the history of Pride is all about and why we continue to have parades, to take pride in our differences and our queerness, and let it not be something that puts us down or that we need to cover up for where we work, or something that can still prevent people from getting even here in Florida, if your landlord finds out you're gay, you can still lose your housing. So like, stuff isn't solved yet just because we can get married. Obviously that's great. Conversion therapy is still a thing in a lot of states. Gay couples still aren't allowed to adopt in many states, so it's just like, there's still more to it. There's still more work that needs to be done. That was a lot.
No, and that actually
all
brings
really
me,
important things.
Yeah, really important, and that brings me to a question of, you touched a little bit about it, but I don't know if you wanted to highlight more like common misconceptions about Pride Month. Is there anything that you want to tell, the community or just the general public about what Pride Month really is?
Yeah, I think those misconceptions, because you hear, like, even people who, you hear stuff like, oh, no, you can do whatever you want. Like, I'm happy for you, but, like, I don't want to see two men kiss. Like, I grew up my entire life watching heterosexual people kiss, and I never complained about it.
That's so true.
Someone tweeted this, made me laugh. Someone tweeted at Netflix, like, I get it, Netflix, can we stop having those, like, unnecessary gay characters? And Netflix tweeted back and was like, every gay character is necessary.
Yeah.
We're so tokenized. Sorry to, like, jump on your... We're so tokenized still. Like, people see a gay character in a movie or a TV show, and they're like, oh, that's just there for inclusivity. Like, we're more than just... And that's every minority community.
Right.
We're more than just that one thing for a diversity quota. You know what I mean? And so it minimizes how important that presence is, because like she's saying, like, I didn't grow up seeing that, so I didn't think it was normal. So when people say, why is that necessary? Because it makes me feel normal when I see myself represented in a non-problematic way, in a non-stereotyped way, in a non-tokenized kind of way.
Yeah, shout out to Netflix for all those gay characters, because I think about, like I said, I grew up in a small town. I didn't come out till I was 21 because I, like, didn't know that gay people existed. Like, I knew one gay kid, and he was made fun of all the time. And so it never even, like, crossed my mind, like, even though, like, things didn't feel right. And now, like, how different would my life have been if I had grown up seeing same-sex couples on TV normalized?
Right.
And so that's why, like, these things are so important. It's about visibility. It's about being able to see, because we're here, we're queer, we're literally everywhere. And people need to know that. Like, kids that are growing up now, like, suicide rates are so high among LGBTQ youth, and trauma rates are so high. Like, that's literally why we're here talking about this at a place that works with people who have experienced trauma, because we know the numbers and we know it's incredibly high. And if we can come out and tell those kids, like, hey, it's okay. There are people in political positions, people who are gay, who have accomplished so much. Like, you have other options. You have a way out. It's going to get better. And that's why Pride's important. It's not, and yeah, like, sometimes we're flashy, but it's because, like, we live in oppression every single day. And that's our one opportunity to come out. Like, on a normal day, sometimes it goes through my head when I'm walking down the street, can I hold hands with my fiance right now? When I'm at Pride, I don't have to think about that. I can just like be a normal person and not have to worry about it. And that's why Pride's so important, I think.
Yeah. And and I think there's something about the queer community that is has taken that oppression and turned it around to just be so free. You know, one of the worst stereotypes that I think we get, and I think this is especially true with gay men, is like the promiscuity. And how like at pride parades it's like, oh well, they're all running around shirtless and in these short shorts and they look so gay and they look so, why do they have to do that? And it's like, is it changing your life? What did it do to you specifically that you're so bothered? If you spend so much time thinking about what's going on underneath, you know what I mean? It sounds like you're thinking about it more than the rest of us are. Like, why is it such a bother? I just don't. It makes, and that's where it fails us into a trope again, where I think that's a lot of the fear is once you come out, the first thing that people's mind think of is sex, right? Like, oh, okay, so now you've told me you're gay, now I know what you like, and now this is what I'm thinking of you. And when I'm talking to a straight person, I'm surely not thinking about whatever they want to do behind their closed doors. Like, it really, I could care less. But for some reason, everyone makes it their business to think about what gay people must be doing in their dark nightclubs and their, like, you know, in their bedrooms, and what are they into. And it's so, like, how is that the first place that everyone's mind seems to go? Like, why is that what we're reduced to is sex acts? And I think the queer community has taken that, turned it around, and sex positivity is so important now for straight and queer people alike. Like, owning your sexuality, being comfortable if, you know, you want to have sex, if you don't want to have sex, whatever. And because we're so used to being tokenized to it, it doesn't, it's not a taboo to us anymore to talk about sex, which I think today in society is a powerful and important thing. To be sex positive, to be sex aware, to know about consent, to know about, be aware of sexual assault, how it impacts our communities. And so that's one thing that people look at pride and they're like, well, why do they have to be like that? Why do they have to wear that? Why do they have to, you know, why is she just wearing like a rainbow bra and he's wearing just like a rainbow Speedo? Like, why is that a big deal? Why are you so bothered?
Right.
You know, it's crazy the things people get caught up on.
Definitely. Yeah. And yeah, I'm hearing a lot that, you know, representation is important, and, you know, being able to come together and be yourself. And, you know, I got chills like you explaining that you have to think, can I hold my fiance's hand down the street? I mean, as someone who identifies as, you know, straight, that is, that's really hard to hear. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. So I wanted to ask, you're both advocates at the Victim Service Center. So thank you for all that you do every day. But as an advocate, how do you advocate during Pride Month?
Well, normally I'm going to events like nonstop during Pride Month to do outreach and just tell people that our services are here. I like to think that I advocate every day in general, just by like authentically living my life as myself. I think that it's important for people to always see that.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think living in that authentic way and passing along information that way, like I make it known to my friend groups, people I meet, like people know what I do, and sometimes I'm surprised the things what people will say and ask, you know, as far as especially being here and working a lot with sexual assault, you know, unfortunately, as loving and open as a place as the queer community can be, like there's bad people everywhere, and so those kinds of things of course still occur in our community, and so making that aware, as uncomfortable as it is to always talk about in any community, it's still important to raise that awareness and advocate for knowing what consent is, knowing how to ask for it, knowing if you have it or not. And some people, I think, want to turn a blind eye. You know, it's another thing that an already oppressed community doesn't want to think about, is the people who are sexually assaulting people within an already small community.
Right.
But it's out there, and so we want to stop that and make the world a better place.
Yeah. We just don't want people to have to go through these things alone. And I always kind of joke about it, because we show up to these happy events that are about pride or really anything, and we set up our table, and it's called the Victim Service Center, so people have to look at the word victim, and we have all these pamphlets and stuff about sexual assault, So you'll see people, like, you know, going along the rows of booths, like, learning about all the different services, seeing, like, all the free stuff that they can pick up, and then they get to our table, and it's, like, wide eyes. Like, they're like, I don't want to talk to you guys, because I don't want to think about this right now. But, I mean, literally 47% of trans people report being sexually assaulted at some point in their life. Like, that's 1 in 2.
Right.
Like, that number is insanely high. Yeah. And those people aren't coming forward as often. So we're at all of these Pride events raising awareness about our services because we want them to know, like, they don't have to go through that alone. They can come to us. We are inclusive. We're accepting. We're going to use, like, whatever name they want to give us, whatever pronouns they want to give us. We're going to respect that. And I think it's even more important at Pride events for people to see that, because also, like, a lot of these people are so isolated. Pride might be the only time of the year that they really, like, leave their house for something other than to go to work or school or something. Yeah. So I think it's even more important for us to be there at those events to let them know, like, hey, we're here and we're here for you.
Yeah, again, that's just that piece of visibility, finally having a place. I mean, people come from way outside of Orlando and, like, these little country towns in Florida just to come to Orlando Pride, so that they can have a place where they're free and safe. So us being there to talk about our services too, I think is critical, because we never know what baggage someone has with them when they're coming into Pride, and how our services, though uncomfortable to talk about sometimes, are so necessary. I wish they weren't necessary. I wish we didn't exist.
I know,
wish,
right?
Not like didn't exist. Like, I'm glad to be here on Earth. But, like, I wish VSC didn't have to exist. Like, that would mean we did our job.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked a little bit about allies, and I wanted to ask, how can individuals be a better ally during Pride Month, and what are some ways to become an ally of the LGBTQ plus community?
I think just showing that support, showing up to Pride, not getting caught up. I don't know, I feel like some people, and sometimes people are trying to learn, and so in that case, ask questions, but also educate yourself. As advocates, I'm happy to answer your questions. If someone reaches out to me and they want to know more, yes, but you can't just go up to any gay person and ask, like, tell me about your community. We can't do that to people of color. We can't assume that there are educators. There's information out there. So educate yourself, or find someone who's in the world to provide that education. I'm happy to do that. I know Emily's happy to do that. Call the center. They're happy to do that. So finding that education, accepting and owning the biases that you have, like, just like every majority person has certain biases about minority communities, because that's just the programming that we're raised in. You know what I mean? Like, no white person is free from having biases against people of color, because that's the society we're raised in. I don't think any straight person is absolutely free from heteronormative biases against the queer community. So it's uncomfortable work, but you have to recognize it. Like, what are my biases? Do I ask myself sometimes, why is there a Pride Month? Do I ask myself sometimes, am I bothered by seeing 2 women kiss or 2 men kiss or whatever? Like, you have to kind of see those and challenge them and tackle them to get past them. A lot of people don't want to do that because they want to seem like, oh, I have no problem. My friend's friend is gay and I don't care. It's like, sure, you don't care, but, like, there still may be biases there. So I always challenge people to see what those are and address them, so that you can move past them and educate yourself about why they might be there. In a society where there's a dominant culture, it always creates stereotypes for the minority cultures, so I think that's a big piece of that, just people owning that and working to get past it. And don't be afraid to come to, like, gay bars and stuff. The music's better, like, the drinks are better, the people are better. Every time, you can include this too, I don't care, I'll say it. Every time I go to a straight bar, everyone is so, like, they're elbowing people out the way. The bars are so crowded. Everyone's, like, rude somehow. Gay bars, everyone's nice. It's fun. Just come to gay bars.
Well, gay means
it's
happy,
better.
right? So
exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's.
Yeah. I think, to me, like, the number one thing about being an ally is just being respectful of people and, like, mirroring the language that they use for themselves. Your own biases are your own biases. If you need to deal with those, if you need to explore those, there are safe places for you to do that. There are, like, I'm sure certain people, or there should be certain people in your life that you can talk to about those things. Like, I'm open to have those conversations with people anytime. But if you're, like, for example, say you're a teacher and you have a student who comes in and their legal name is not the name that they go by. If someone's name is Michael on paper and they say, call me Mike, do you say, no, I'm going to call you Michael because that's what's on this piece of paper here? No, you call them Mike. So if a trans kid comes into your class and says, those are not the pronouns I use, that's not the name that I use, just you, like, especially with suicide rates, like, that could literally be the difference in, like, life or death for that child, for you to just affirm their identity and use their name and keep your own biases to yourself.
Right. I mean, what a way to make that, in that example, like, make it all about themselves, you know, like, well, I'm uncomfortable saying this, so I'm not well, it's really not about you.
Yeah.
So, like,
so that's what, like, the biggest way to be an ally is just to, like, put yourself aside, put your own views aside, and be there for that person in the moment and follow them with what they need.
Definitely. Very, very well said. Thank you both for sharing all of those points. So we talked a lot about, you know, Pride and how we're going to be celebrating it this year, or how we assume maybe how it's going to go. But I wanted to check in, you know, as kind of a final question, how is the Victim Service Center celebrating Pride Month this year?
So all of our social media will be rebranded with rainbows.
Love it.
We are really fortunate to work here. It really has been, like, such a game changer for me because I've never worked somewhere where I could be so open and so honest about everything, including, like, my identity. And everyone's very supportive, where everyone's participating in acts of love and kindness, which we have not released what exactly we're doing yet.
Surprise.
We have, like, we've done Gay Jeopardy.
yeah.
We have all kinds of events here. Normally when Pride events come around, like, everyone's very eager to jump in. Everybody wants to work the Pride events every year. So this, I'm sure, will be no different, where when every time I like send out an email being like, hey, I need somebody to help me with this, everyone's very quick to jump on top of it. We especially, like, we have a lot of bilingual advocates, and you also can't talk about Pulse without talking about, like, the effects that it had on the Hispanic community. And our Hispanic advocates are always very quick to jump in and help us however they can. So I'm not sure, like, what exactly we have planned yet, other than our Acts of Love and Kindness and Orlando United Day events. But we will definitely be participating in everything as much as we can.
Awesome.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I mean, this podcast will have another Pride-related podcast coming at you later this month.
Our follow-up reflection podcast will be at the end of the month.
Yes.
I'm very excited.
Yeah, but we're always doing stuff. Also, as a random shout-out, I don't know if anyone has seen this yet, but everyone who's listening in the world should go, if you want to educate yourself more about queer communities, especially in, like, small towns, and how necessary Pride and visibility is, go to HBO, go pay for HBO, get good friends HBO, and watch We're Here. Like, it's like, we're here, we're queer. It's a show about 3 famous drag queens, and they go to these, like, small towns, middle of nowhere. Like, people have called the police on them at some points in the show, like, just the craziest things. They show up in full drag, and they make over community members or allies or people who aren't allies, and they're challenging themselves to be one. And they do a show for the community and bring queer representation, visibility to these places. It's really good. It reads similar to, like, Queer Eye, where it's that kind of going to these places and bringing our community there. It's really good, and it shows that importance of Pride, and I think it's a great watch for this Pride Month. There's only 6 episodes for the first season. Hopefully they do a season 2 because it was really good.
That sounds awesome. I'm definitely going to have to check that out. Thanks so much for sharing that. Is there anything else before we sign off that either of you want to, you know, touch about in general about Pride or the Victim Service Center, anything like that?
I think just remember that our services are here for anyone who's listening, anyone who maybe didn't know as much about our services and was like, oh, let's listen to this fun podcast about pride. We have LGBTQ advocates here at Victim Service Center. We have our Rainbow Resilience group, which is specifically for LGBTQ people who have experienced sexual assault. We would love to help educate you if you need anything, like if you have any questions about anything. There's just so many different resources. You've got here in town, we have Zebra Coalition, who they not only serve LGBTQ youth, but they have parent groups. So if your child has just come out and you're not really sure what to do, there's other agencies like PFLAG, which is Parents and Families of Lesbians and Gays. That's one of the first LGBTQ organizations that popped up just to help people. Like, it can sometimes be a really confusing time when someone comes out, whether it's you that's coming out or a loved one or a family member or what. So just remember that those resources are out there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful place to kind of sign off here. So thank you, the listener, for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear. You are not alone. And thank you so much, Kevin and Emilie, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Yes, I was glad to do it.